I'm joined by the author of the Strength in Numbers Substack, Elliot Morris. Elliot, thanks so much for coming on. We have some news in terms of what the polling right now shows in terms of Donald Trump's deployment of his troops into Los Angeles here. So can you give a little bit of information in terms of what that polling actually reflects?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, Brian. Look, the polling shows that the average American does not like when federal troops come into their neighborhood to do basically any sort of police action that they like are removed from. So there's this new YouGov poll that's out today, for example, and they ask U.S. adults, do you support Donald Trump deploying the National Guard to Los Angeles to, do law enforcement efforts related to protests there? And by a 7 point margin, people say no, they do not approve of sending the National Guard. YouGov also asked, do you support sending the Marines there? And people were even more opposed to that. I imagine because it evokes some sort of real official military action that Americans traditionally are averse to the military being deployed in their streets.
Yeah.
So I imagine that's the association going on in their head.
So the difficult thing for me to reconcile is that Donald Trump wouldn't do something to distract from his already failing agenda as it relates to this budget bill, as it relates to his fallout with Elon Musk, as it relates to stripping healthcare away from 14 million Americans and blowing up to the deficit to the tune of trillions of dollars. Wouldn't do something that's going to be, at least in his mind, as politically disadvantageous as those things. You would presume that if he can spark some type of rebellion here and kind of get into a scenario that would do better for him, that would be preferable. And so is this just backfiring on him in the sense that this is actually polling worse than he probably anticipated?
Yeah, look, Donald Trump is not an idiot when it comes to public opinion,
Right.
maybe in other ways, but not when it comes to public opinion. He reads the polls. He has people in the White House who are telling him where the public are on issues, and he has a pretty good read of where they are on immigration. That's why he's president.
Right.
The thing that I think he's indexing on is the previous data. I think people in the White House see that Trump has traditionally been approved of on immigration in general. And when it comes to quelling violence in the street, they have some experience dealing with that as well in ways that they think goes well for them. And I'll also just add, the previous data we had on LA was about the protesters themselves. YouGov also asked, do you approve of the protesters doing the things they're doing? And Americans said no. By a 9 point margin, they said no. So what we have here is two sort of paradoxical findings. We have, first off, the protesters are unpopular, but also people don't support sending in the National Guard to deal with those protests. So I think the White House is probably at risk of overextending here in their treatment of these protesters. And that's more political than anything. I don't think that has anything to do with public opinion. I think that's all politics, all enforcement, all posturing.
So is the goal here for Trump to try and incite such a response that the dissatisfaction with the protesters outshines the dissatisfaction with the fact that he's sending in the National Guard and the Marines?
Yeah, I mean, the traditional finding on this is that violence doesn't do well with the public, and that's true from the police, and that's also true from
Right, and
protesters.
that's the difficult part here because there's
Yeah.
violence happening on two fronts. There is the violence being perpetuated by law enforcement that was sent in by Trump against the protesters, but then there's also obviously unrest, and we're seeing a few isolated scenarios where there are cars being set on fire, for example, and so you have these two kind of contradictory instances where there is violence, but it's owed to two different political factions.
Yeah, that's right. So if the images that people are seeing on their screens at home are of, protesters standing on burned down squad cars,
Yeah.
that's a different image. That's the image that Trump wants, but that's a very different image than the ones of, hundreds of guards standing in the same place facing down small crowds of peaceful protesters. I think that's the one that will end up eating at them if, if there's no more of the violent unrest. But as we know, these situations can devolve pretty quickly on both sides. So that's hard to predict.
Is there any historical precedent here, for example, as it relates to Kenosha? The last time there was something similar that Donald Trump is kind of hanging his hat on, or that we can compare these results to?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump's frame of reference here is that he was president during the BLM protests and some of the riots in 2020, and his frame of mind is we sent in the National Guard to deal with that, and they think it worked well for them. And the academic evidence suggests that in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after some of the violence there, there was a small localized shift toward Donald Trump. In other words, there was a backlash to the violence in that protest. But that's not true anywhere else in the country in 2022. The evidence from 2020, sorry, from 2020, in 2020, the evidence is that the protests on average helped Democrats. They helped the cause, so to speak. And by increasing support for Democrats and decreasing support for Trump, the people presumably being protested or wrapped up in the protest sentiment. So I'm thinking that, if I'm in the White House right now, my playbook is what I did in 2020. And I think that's what we're seeing. Just send in the National Guard to deal with it.
So, given the fact that the Trump administration lost support in the BLM protests when they sent in the National Guard, why would they repeat the same playbook that was ultimately detrimental to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's their political playbook. It's their side's playbook, right? Among the people that they socialize with, among, what they're trying to accomplish, which is, like a forceful crackdown on
Right.
immigration.
So,
This is the playbook you try to use for that. But I don't think it's informed by public opinion.
is this just red meat for the base then? Like, he's not interested right now in June of an off year in kind of appealing to independents or even conservative Democrats. He's just saying, like, look, I came in with an agenda that I want to perpetuate, and that is this major crackdown on big blue bastions within big blue states.
Yeah, he thinks that doing this part of his agenda, the very firm law and order part, not the like any of the other laws he's broken, but this law and order
Right,
part,
right.
is popular for him, and it's going to win him support for doing the adjacent part of his agenda, which is to deport everyone here illegally, which also requires a lot of force. So if you can sell the public on this use of force against the protesters, perhaps you can apply it to the use of force for immigration enforcement. I think that's the calculation they're trying to make in their head.
Do you have any idea of how Donald Trump is looking more broadly in terms of his polling? And I ask on two issues in particular, and that is immigration and the economy. He won the presidency in 2024 based on those two issues, on how he was able to exploit those issues. There was a ton of pain that Americans were contending with as it relates to high inflation. And of course, the way that Joe Biden handled immigration was a major vulnerability for him as well. And so he came in office with major advantages on those two issues, but we've seen those numbers kind of dwindle down. And so where are we at right now in terms of his two perceived strengths from when he first came into office?
Yeah, so when Donald Trump took office, there was about a 10 percentage point advantage for him on immigration. So 10 percentage points more people said they approved of him than disapproved of him. And on the economy, it was the same, about 10 percentage point advantage. So he comes into office and he has some force of a mandate, he would call it, but he has the public on his side on these issues.
Right.
Today, there's a 3 point gap on immigration, so smaller, still an advantage, but much smaller. And he's 14 percentage points underwater on the economy, and he's 20 percentage points underwater on inflation. And I think that represents a broader dissatisfaction among the public with all presidents or any president that would have in office right now on the economy, cost of living, social mobility, et cetera, is just sort of terrible for a lot of people. And it represents some backlash to the administration on deportations, which we know are going beyond the sanction of public opinion. People don't want their grandma deported. They don't want, the person who lived next door for 20 years who's not a criminal immigrant or a convicted criminal, especially not a convicted violent criminal deported. They don't want the person at the diner who serves them waffles deported.
Right. And I mean, he actually came in, like you said, with some degree of a mandate. But I think that was on the actual issues that he promised, which is that he's going to go after hardened criminals. And we're seeing now, as they've ramped up enforcement on these deportations, that, like, if you're just waiting for workers outside of a Home Depot, if you're just plucking kids out of schools, if you're, I mean, there was a few instances where kids who are stricken with cancer are even being deported. So if you're focusing on those people, does that not just squander any of the mandate, any of the goodwill that you engendered by coming in and saying that you're going to focus on one subset of people and then instead just broadening out to a whole swath of of members in good standing of the community?
Well, the thing is, Donald Trump basically sold the American people on a fiction with immigration. He said there's tens of millions of
Right.
violent criminals out there who are here illegally, who we are going to round up and deport, and it's
And
going
it
to
just
be easy
wasn't true. There just
because we
weren't
know
the
where they
numbers to
are.
back it up.
Yeah, and those people do not exist in the
Right.
numbers that the Donald Trump administration promised them that they did, and so they're having to, they have this goal from Stephen Miller of deporting 3,000 people a day, which is just impossible. And to do that, they're going to have to deport a lot of people that aren't the people they promised because they don't exist in the right amount of numbers, and that's going to cause that could cause backlash. It seems to have caused some amount of backlash so far. I think the idea is that for Democrats right now, if they can sell the protests, first off, if there's not as much violence going forward, if they can sell the administration's actions with federal military troops as enforcing that unpopular part of their agenda, deporting the people that American citizens do want to stay here,
Right.
then they can score political points that way.
Well, one of those people who was wrongly deported was Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And so what did the polling show with regard to that specific instance that we can, obviously extrapolate into a broader understanding of the popularity of his agenda?
Yeah, I mean, we did two things around that time. So this was in mid to late April. What we did was we looked at media attention to Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and we looked at Donald Trump's overall and his immigration specific approval rating. And what you can see is basically there's a completely like inverse relationship between these things. As media attention goes up, Trump's approval rating falls, and it falls to the lowest point of his cycle at exactly 2 days after media attention to Kilmar Abrego Garcia is at its highest. So, that would like be a feather in the Democratic cap right now. They should say, we support law and order. We want to, build the border wall, whatever, give like the red meat to the base that needs to have red meat, and then oppose the excessive deportations that are unpopular and where we have some evidence that have moved the needle against Donald Trump. And I think that's like a strong values position for the party, and it's one that they've tested so far.
So it seems like the through line in everything that we've spoken about is that when we have instances of government overreach, when we have instances where the Trump administration is illegally deporting somebody who shouldn't be deported because he wasn't given due process, when we have instances where Donald Trump sends in and federalizes the National Guard, sends in the U.S. Marines, like those are the instances where Donald Trump actually faces a lot of backlash that's reflected in the polling. Is that correct?
Yeah, people wanted orderly deportation of criminals that they had never met or that didn't, that really didn't seem to exist from their neighborhoods, from the people, from the places around them, and they wanted crime to fall as a result. That's what they wanted. Everything else that they've got from the Donald Trump administration is not supported by the public, and yeah, plays into lots of like classical examples of government overreach, of a fear of government deploying military in your streets, martial law, even. I mean, these are not things that are traditionally considered popular in American politics. The only reason we think that they could be popular is because it's on an issue that Donald Trump has previously had an advantage on.
Elliot, where can folks who are watching right now hear more from you?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. They can go to the Strength in Numbers Substack website, and that's just my name, gelliottmorris.com. You can probably Google, it'll be the first result, I'm sure.
Great. I'll put that link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. If you're listening on the podcast, that'll be in the show notes as well. Elliot, appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks, Brian.